Hey everybody, Aaron here from the Ones Ready team. If you aren't already subscribed to the podcast before listening to this episode, please take this time and go do so. If you're subscribed over the YouTube, leave us a like, leave us a comment, turn on those notifications. If not, you can download us wherever it is that you get your podcast, whether it be from Apple, Spotify, Podbean, or somewhere else. Just go ahead and leave us a review on whatever platform you're on. It really does help us get in front of people and really helps us get the information to the people that need it the absolute most. So take this time just before we hop into this episode to please go like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends, and help get this official, unofficial podcast of the United States Air Force out to the people that can use it most. This week, we go through a pretty tough one. We've talked about HKIA before, the end of GWAT, the retrograde of Afghanistan. We've done episodes on the fall of HKIA with Chief Master Sergeant retired Chad McCoy. We had a 1 year after episode. Go and check the channel for all of these. Today, we sit down with two Army aviators that were intimately involved with getting the Special Mission Wing. So these are the Afghani pilots and aircrew members that actually populated the Special Mission Wing. The Army worked closely to train those pilots. The Army and the Air Force worked closely to train those pilots to be able to take over the defense of their own country. These two Army aviators were intimately involved in 2020 and 2021 with the retrograde and the closing, essentially, of Afghanistan. We'll start off with Nick Holten. Nick is a career U.S. Army aviator and a veteran of numerous combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan during GWAT. He has extensive security force assistance and foreign internal defense. That's the training of our partner forces background, and was selected to be the Special Mission Wing Special Operations Advisory Team South Commander. He was also the senior airfield authority at Kandahar Airfield. Nick was on mission in Helmand Province when the president announced the retrograde from Afghanistan, beginning a 30-day timetable to close Kandahar Airfield and consolidate forces to HKIA in Kabul. After moving to Kabul, he spearheaded the efforts to continue to train, advise, and equip the Special Mission Wing from an over-the-horizon capacity, assembling a team to relocate to the Special Operations Command Central Forward Component at Al Udeid Air Base, or AUAB, in Qatar, and left Afghanistan in the summer of 2022, just prior to the retrograde in August. While at AUAB, Nick was formally assigned to the OTH-CT headquarters. Nick and his team began working alongside U.S. SOCOM and OGA elements in Kabul and back in the U.S. to coordinate evacuation efforts for those Special Mission Wing personnel and their families. You'll see from the podcast how intensely involved and how much Nick cared for these Special Mission Wing brothers that he worked alongside. We mentioned in Nick's bio, or I just mentioned in Nick's bio, that he was working with people that were over the horizon, that were working both back stateside, in country, deployed somewhere in Europe or in the Middle East, and even some folks that were all the way back here that were helping. One of those people that was back here, Lieutenant Colonel Marvin L. Lee Chase. Now, he's a former pararescueman. He goes by Lee. He and I made a link up, obviously wearing the same hats at one part of our life. He said, hey, I've got this story. Check out this article. It's called Escape from Afghanistan, which was an article that he published in War on the Rocks. I urge you to go read that to get the full backstory of how Lee and Nick met and then go forward and the things that they actually did in Afghanistan. Currently, Lieutenant Colonel Chase, former PJ, is currently a resident student at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He's a former PJ and a current Army aviator who has commanded a theater fixed-wing battalion, special operations advisory team, and a theater fixed-wing company. He's flown various aircraft, including the 64, the C-12, PC-12, 787. Lee's most recent of multiple deployments was to Afghanistan in 2021. And again, that article, Escape from Afghanistan, has been published on War on the Rocks. Lee and Nick intimately cared for these people that they had worked with at the end of GWAT. Through multiple deployments, you make connections and you make real relationships with these partner force folks that you're talking to. As we went to the end, as we were starting to retrograde from Kabul to HKIA, away from Bagram, there were a lot of people inside of that Special Missions Wing that were going to be targeted by the Taliban, and we knew that this was going to happen. Lee and Marvin, along with the help of some other folks that were hoping to get on the podcast, some congressmen, some other people that were involved, from both of their individual areas. Lee was, you'll hear, he was back here in the States, and Nick was actually on mission on the ground in Afghanistan. They helped effectuate the rescue of what turned out to be the largest humanitarian airlift that the United States has ever seen, okay, that the world has ever seen, to evacuate these friends and allies from Afghanistan. Lee and Nick, obviously charged with emotion, talk about this event. It's a good one. It sucks because I was on the road, so I didn't have the best setup. But the point is that Lee and Chase tell the story of the humanity that happened at HKIA, and their actions help save the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands of individuals. So huge thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Marvin Chase for coming on, for Nick Holten for coming on. I appreciate you both. The people appreciate you both. This is a great episode. There's going to be more after this initial episode. We're going to bring on some more people that were involved in this part of the event, and we're going to talk to them more too. So stay tuned. All that being said, without further ado, let's get to this podcast with Nick Holten and Marvin Lee Chase talking about the fall of Afghanistan.
MW SOAT South Commander down in Kandahar, while Lee was the Central Commander up in HKIA. So we were involved with a lot of the planning on how do we train and support Special Mission Wing brothers after we depart from Afghanistan. And so Kandahar was one of the first places to close right after the president made his announcement. We had 30 days to leave Kandahar airfield, and we moved everybody up to HKIA. And that's when I was co-located with Lee, and then we tried to figure out, what does support for SMW look like after Americans are no longer in the country. And I was identified to go down to the SOCCENT Forward Headquarters at LUD Air Base and kind of, map out what that looked like. What countries we going to conduct training in? How are we going to get supplies and parts and all types of stuff into Afghanistan after we're gone? And that's when the fall of Kabul seemed more and more foregone. And so we had to rapidly kind of change what our, 5 different country support plan, and how do we get parts for Mi-17s and PC-12s into Afghanistan, to like, how do we just get people out of harm's way in a very short amount of time. And that's kind of where the story began. I just wanted to set the stage a little bit. So Lee had already redeployed. Our SOJIF Alpha commander had decided, we were kind of going to leave a little bit early before the president's deadline of September 11th. So kind of mid-July is when everybody kind of left Afghanistan. And, some of us went down to Qatar. Everybody else went back to the United States and tried to support efforts from there. And then we very rapidly figured out that all of this, months worth of planning that we had been doing is kind of out the window. And what does it look like now? And then that's kind of the perspective from Kandahar down to Qatar. And I'll pass it over to Lee for what he saw from back in the U.S.
Well, I want to focus on one thing that you said here, because I find it really, really interesting. The other HKIA episodes that I've done. Can you speak to the feeling on the ground, especially from those Special Mission Wing brothers and sisters, that as this starts developing, it gets real, more real every day, more real every day. It gets to be July and we're packing bags up now. How did that affect your Special Mission Wing brothers and sisters? Were they excited to get into the fight? Were they apprehensive? What was the feeling like as that all started to play out?
Yeah, it was bizarre, for lack of a better term. I was forward deployed from Kandahar over to Helmand. So we were at Camp Bastion, doing operations out there, some time-sensitive targeting operations. And so I'm there helping mission plan, and then kind of C2 from Camp Bastion when President Biden made the announcement that we are going to withdraw from Afghanistan, and it's going to be on kind of a rapid timeline. So I had to meet with my first squadron SMW counterpart, Lieutenant Colonel Momand Kosar. And so they were on the Americans were all sequestered to kind of new Camp Bastion, very small compound out in Helmand. And all the Afghans were on the Afghan side of the base. So I had to coordinate a place and time to meet him to kind of give him the news about, what does all of this mean? And so we were there with some folks from 10th Group that were kind of, helping us with the real estate and the comms piece and the coordination for all of the missions we were doing. And so I asked him, like, hey, I've got to meet my Afghan counterpart on this part of the base. Like, is there a walkthrough gate or someplace where I can easily get out there and have a conversation with him? And they're like, brother, you can't go out there by yourself. Like, what do you mean? Like, I talk to this guy on the ramp at Kandahar all the time by myself. And they're like, yeah, this is Helmet. We're going to go with you. And so
Yeah,
I bring a kitted up ODA, 10 guys, all escort me out there. And I kind of meet him, and he's a little off put by, the heavy hitters that I've got, on my left and my
sure.
right out there. He's like,
Right.
what's going on? And I have to tell him, like, we're leaving. And he's like, yeah, I saw the announcement September. Yeah, it's kind of fast. And I tell him, like, it's going to be a whole lot faster than September 11th, because this is May. And he's like, okay. I said, well, let's do our operations out here. We'll get back to Kandahar. We'll talk about what the plan is. But it's going to be faster in September. And he's like, okay. We finish everything up in Helmand, come back to Kandahar, and then I tell him the plan, and I go over all the property that we're going to leave in Kandahar and everything that's got to come with us. And then it finally sinks in with my counterpart. He's like, oh man, you guys are leaving and you're taking all the stuff. I'm like, yeah, sorry. And that's when it started to get weird down there. Because before that, I mean, it's all friendly, smiles, handshakes, and hugs every time you see them. But after we start to, remove equipment and take people away and collapse everybody on New Camp Brown on Kandahar, then he finally realized kind of the gravity of what was about to happen. And it didn't really get weird down there until we started to pull off some of the, we call it aviation or aircraft survivability equipment, like the heat-seeking missile countermeasures and stuff like that, the flare buckets from the helicopters, because they belong to us. So when I started to take those off of his aircraft,
that had to be an emotional event. Imagine.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Put yourself in that situation. Like, hey, bro, what are you doing?
Right.
Those things saved my life. Yeah, imagine the tension that caused.
And that's exactly what he said. He's like, I need those. Like, I totally agree
Sure.
with you, but they got to come with me. Like that's the deal. And then it got weird. So then we stopped going down there alone. We made our Afghan counterparts come to our side of the airfield to have meetings and things like that. We didn't go to the Afghan side anymore. And then, in 30 days, every last American, to include all of the contractors, we vacated Kandahar. We kind of did it in the middle of the night because we didn't want, just in case there was any ill will, we didn't want anything to kind of impede our departure from the airfield. And we absconded in hours of darkness, and everybody moved up to HKIA. And then it was like a different country. Like nobody in HKIA seemed like any of this was happening. The mood in Kandahar was, a mixture of disappointment and terror and anger. And then you get to HKIA, and I mean, the embassies having parties, and everybody's smiling and handshakes.
You're never giving up Bagram. I mean,
right,
why would you ever give up Bagram? I mean, that's always like, you look back at it now, and that's one of those outstanding questions that, you'll armchair quarterback with your boys sitting around the bar of, hey, I would have done this or I would have done that. But I mean, there was a feeling of safety there. I went to Bagram multiple times. I was at Bastion too. I was in and out of Kandahar. We didn't have teams there when I was doing my rotations, but I was all over that spot, and Bagram felt like home base. Like, yeah, you would take incoming, but man, you could largely kind of like fix that. And it was rockets that weren't really well aimed, but Bagram sort of felt like that home. And when it started to get weird, it started to get real weird. Lee, when that's what was all taking place, and you were no stranger to these unsettling events, and you had had enough experience with them where I'm sure it didn't get your heart rate up a whole lot, but as it was getting weird for you and you were starting to insert yourself into this stuff, what were you thinking going into this whole thing?
So for me, it was a different perspective. Nick mentioned that at HKIA, the vibe was just different. So my relationships actually continued to evolve in a positive way with my Afghan partners. But Nick, you talking about this at Kandahar reminded me of a self-critiquing event that I took part in. And that was probably a week or two after Nick and the rest of the Americans left Kandahar. I flew a mission down there in the PC-12 with one of my Afghan pilots. And it was a very creepy feeling getting out of that airplane and literally being the only American on that airfield.
That's wild. That had to be just absolutely wild.
So that's the first and the last time that I did that. And there were no issues, right?
Yeah.
But it was definitely a creepy feeling, as I mentioned.
You had to feel like you were just on the moon. I can't explain it. Like it's one of those things that you can't possibly explain to somebody, but it's something that if
Yeah.
somebody knows what you're talking about, then no explanation is needed. I've been in a foreign country and the helicopter's taking off and there's that moment of silence and you look around, you're like, am I on a different planet right now? Like that had to be
Right.
your experience had to be like the ultimate of I am on the moon. I am in the wilderness right now. Like did that feeling ever strike you? Like how did you shake that as you went forward with this event?
I just was very aware of my surroundings, as you can imagine. And we were only there for probably an hour or so, but I just made sure that my SA was up and, I stayed close to the guy I was flying with.
Longest hour of your life, right? Like the old
Absolutely.
joke goes. Like the old joke goes, if I only have 6 hours left to live, I want to do it in combat because it'll be the longest 6 hours I've ever had. As you start spinning up and things get more real and you realize that, that feeling of Bagram being safe zone, Ali Ali oxen free, when did that start to crumble for you? And you're like, oh no, we're going to leave Bagram.
Honestly, my focus wasn't on Bagram. My
Okay.
focus was more on HKIA. So, I mean, that was in the back of my mind, of course, but my focus was really on keeping the relationships and continuing to develop those relationships with these guys that I had become so close with. And as you can imagine, many of them were approaching me to write them letters to get special immigrant visas and perhaps a P1 visa or something that would get them and their families out of the country and to safety. Because at first, I don't know that they believed we were actually going to leave. But as time went on, it sunk in more. And I was as honest with them as I could be based on the information that I had. I shared what I could with them. And I let them know, like, we're leaving. This isn't a bluff. It's not anything other than the truth. And as Nick mentioned earlier, it's going to happen quickly. We're not going to be here until September.
And what a feeling for them that had to be hearing that news. And as it started picking up, the rescue of attempt and then the huge non-combatant evacuation operation that happened out of HKIA, as that started to pick up speed, a whole bunch of people found that those relationships that they had built were the most valuable thing that they had. Having that text message, having that ability to reach out and say, hey, do you know this person working at this gate? Do you know this person that's over here? That sort of very new modern way to affect this person movement, if you want to call it that, was mind blowing. And we saw a bunch of different people do it. As you started to realize that there was a huge humanitarian situation brewing at HKIA, Nick, did you immediately go into mission planning mode? Had you already been working on it? Like your timeline was short. You have this strained relationship with your partners who you probably needed their help on the ground, honestly, to get everything out. It would be a terribly tough scenario to be like, hey, can you help me load this box that we're taking your anti-missile systems in this box? Can you help me load it? Because I need your help. What was it like during that time?
I'd like to say that we had the foresight and planning that, had all of the chess pieces on the board and ready for all of the things that had happened during the fall of Kabul, but that absolutely was not the case. Like we were working up until the last second on, how do we get special mission wing crews to Uzbekistan or to UAE to train on the different aircraft, and how do we have this like 3-tiered training plan to include stuff back in CONUS, lots of partner forces and partner nations helping us out in the Middle East and throughout the Central Asian states. And it was, a super complex plan, one of the most complex that I've worked on in my 22 years in the Army. And we had kind of stayed married to that, whether or not it was just the sheer fact of all of the work that we had put into this effort. We didn't want to abandon it. But when all of my SMW counterparts in Kandahar, Americans had all left, when they finally left Kandahar and all came up to HKIA, in hindsight, that should have been the writing on the wall where, okay, we need to change our plan. Like this is not going how we thought it was going to be, but we didn't. Like, we were confident that Afghanistan would stay strong and the Afghan National Army forces and ANISOC would be able to resist any kind of Taliban effort to try to recapture territory. And then we just watched it every night on the sit reps, all the provinces that turned from green to red overnight. You're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And so it wasn't until the 82nd had come into HKIA right as we closed Bagram, and when they sealed the gates, I think was the day where we were like, okay, we're going to have to do some contingency planning here, because none of this now is going according to how we thought it was going to go. And that's when our SMW brothers also kind of realized, like, okay, I can no longer leave work and leave my compound and go back to my house and see my family. Like, they can't come in, I can't go out. We've got to, change our planning as well. And just the evolution of the events, because that all kind of happened over a 48-hour period between when the gates are closed. Nobody, even from our secure compound, can go in and out of HKIA before our SMW counterparts decided, all right, we're going to take all the flyable aircraft and we're going to leave Afghanistan, because I don't think we can rely on our American friends to do any of this for us. And that's, why we're on the podcast, because this is where the story gets super interesting. But I mean, up until the last second, we were committed to the plan of, supporting SMW, sovereign Afghan government, and sovereign military forces that were totally capable of fighting against the Taliban, and a year and a half, 2 years, maybe even longer before the Taliban had any kind of reasonable foothold inside of Afghanistan. And then we watched it unfold in a matter of days, just before they were surrounding Kabul. And we knew all of our planning was now out the window.
Right. So, I mean, where do you go from there? So you guys had to you held on to the very last second. It feels almost like blackjack, doesn't it? You lose a hand and you're like, no. I'm just going to bet twice as much on this next hand and we're going to get out of it. And then you catch that run of bad breaks and bad luck. And then suddenly you're like, oh man, we got to go back to the drawing board, because, I always say in mission planning, the first thing you have to do is define your problem. Like, what is it? What am I doing here? And fundamentally for you guys, what are we doing here changed. You went from a tactical retrograde to, the largest humanitarian effort, in recent modern war history, like definitely all of GWAT. And the fact that it's kind of bookending GWAT made it even more, made it even more heavy for the entire population. And seeing those images, obviously they're burned into our brain. When things started picking up at HKIA, Lee, when did you realize that, hey, what we're here to do is now changing into something completely different? And then, what did you do?
So again, completely different perspective. I left Afghanistan June 16th, went to Kuwait for a week or so, and then redeployed home. So on August 15th, I was in the comfort of my home and got a call from Masood, one of my Afghan brothers. They had just landed back at HKIA. Him and a group of Afghan pilots and mission system operators had gone in a flight of 5 PC-12s up to the Uzbekistan border and been turned away. So others had gotten in previously, but they were turned away in their flight of 5. And they initially called to see if I could help them get fuel on HKIA. And they ended up taking fuel by force, got their airplanes refueled. But in the meantime, my brother-in-law, Gus Garcia Jr., who I had spoken with just a few days before that about connecting me with a congressman he knew by the name of Vicente Gonzalez from South Texas, I reached out to Gus and I said, I need to talk to the congressman now. And he immediately connected me with Congressman Gonzalez, who was in Spain drinking wine with his wife. And I told him the situation. He just happened to be, as fate would have it, the chairman of the Uzbekistan caucus and had a relationship with the foreign minister of Uzbekistan, made a phone call to him, and shortly thereafter, they had permission to go into Uzbekistan.
Just all through relationships and knowing who to call and knowing how to connect those pieces. I just picture
you said it earlier, brother. I mean, relationships are everything. And in this story, they certainly are. And we'll talk more about them as the story unfolds. But relationships with a congressman through my brother-in-law, my relationship and friendship with Nick, and then several others who we'll talk about here in a few minutes.
And were you two linked up at this time? Like you were talking, what was the relationship like between the two of you while this stuff was starting to unfold?
Yeah. So while all of this was happening back with Lee in the U.S. and Congressman Gonzalez, I'm sitting in my office. The Sojidif Alpha headquarters had moved fully down to Saksent Forward at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and we had reflagged to become the over-the-horizon counterterrorism headquarters. And so we're working, not just the Afghanistan support piece, but now kind of more efforts inside CASA. And our J3 calls me on the phone. He's like, "Hey, are you guys running a mission tonight?" Because I took all of the SMW SOAT remnants and brought them with me to our headquarters down in Qatar. So we're still working the special mission wing problem. And so he called and said, "Right, are you guys running a mission tonight?" I'm like,
what a great feeling when the J3 calls you to ask you if you're doing something. What a great start to a phone call. Hey, this is so and so from the J3. I'm the desk sergeant. You got people out there, and you're just flat-footed. Like, oh really?
And I think it's a testament to how, like Lee described it, how weird the mood got. Both,
Sure.
what I felt down in Kandahar, and then when everybody, as we're packing up all the equipment and putting it on C5s and C17s and leaving HKIA, how it went from like you drive around. Part of the way that I would go from where we were living on Camp Courage on HKIA to the SMW compound is you essentially left the airport and you're just driving in Afghanistan, but you go through a few ANA checkpoints on the way, and at first it's cool, and you're in an up armored Land Cruiser, it's totally fine, and you got your kit on and your M4s on your lap, and you've got a round in the chamber in your Glock. You feel totally secure, and everybody's waving at you, and they recognize you from day to day. But then, the waves stopped, but they'd still smile, and then the smiles stopped. And you're like, "Oh man, this just doesn't feel right. This is weird." And so a lot of that sentiment was kind of left over. Our Afghan partners are feeling like, they're kind of betrayed. We preached shoulder to shoulder this whole time. We're committed to your freedom and your sovereignty and supporting you and your organization. And then super quickly we all leave. And so there's presumably this huge sense of abandonment and betrayal that they're all feeling. So of course they don't tell me that they're planning this huge operation to depart Afghanistan in the middle of the night with all of the flyable aircraft that they have. They didn't trust me enough because I'm in Qatar. Like I'm not with them anymore. And so the J3 calls, says, "Hey, you got a big mission going on?" Like, and you have that weird feeling like, great, what ball did I drop? I have no idea. Yeah.
Can I get 5 minutes, my dude? I'll call you right back.
Yeah. And we had left a few people with the ANASOC liaison cell at the embassy compound in Kabul. And so I called my liaison there. I'm like, "Hey, what's going on?" He's like, "Dude, I don't know, but like 16 aircraft just took off from HKIA and headed north." I'm like, "All right." And so we get on the internet on ADSB and we're following the aircraft. And, as people crossed the border before that, the phone call that Lee got that some aircraft had been turned around, a lot of aircraft successfully had landed in Uzbekistan. And before the Uzbek authorities had taken all of their cell phones, as soon as our crews landed, they're texting me and they tell me all of what just went on. They essentially had gone out with the families that were able to get onto HKIA before the gates were closed and all of the SMW personnel. And they loaded up all the people and all of the belongings that they could on every aircraft that could start. And they flew it from HKIA across the border to the north. And then so I'm getting after the fact the whole story about how General Zermal, the SMW wing commander, had planned this, and they kind of did it in secret, and then just left. I mean, they didn't even call HKIA Tower to ask for a clearance to depart. They just took off and went north. And I'm finding it out now when they're on the ground in Uzbekistan, and then all of a sudden the text messages and the phone calls just stopped because the Uzbeks, kind of arrested them, took their cell phones, took all of their communication, and now you're left in a panic like, "Oh my gosh, what just happened? How can I help? What do we do now?" And luckily Lee had that connection with the congressman that had miraculous relationships and connections that, I mean, as far as planets aligning and everything coming together all at once, I don't think that there could have been a better scenario than Lee being able to get in touch with Congressman Gonzalez.
So as Congressman Gonzalez, as he starts to weigh in, Lee, and as you guys start to kind of coordinate, what's your next step in this entire thing? Because how many personnel, Nick, can you tell me how many personnel ended up flying north and getting out of Afghanistan? That's amazing.
Yeah, it was, what did we say, Lee? About 450, I think, were the final numbers.
Sounds about right.
Yeah.
That's rowdy. So as these things are developing, and we realize that there's a mass migration event that is starting to happen, and people are doing it on their own. Lee, how are you involved, and what did you start pointing Congressman Gonzalez at to kind of fix? Because he's a problem solver, right? You take him a problem, and he's like, hey, I think that I can make this connection, or I think I can solve this problem. So what was the next problem that you guys encountered?
The next problem was that, as Nick mentioned, they were essentially arrested. Maybe that's a strong word, but they were detained.
Detained? I've been detained
Now, they
before.
Yeah. Right. So they were treated relatively well. Now, some of the low-ranking guards and such were threatening them with, we're going to send you back to the Taliban and that type of thing, which, of course, was scary for them, understandably. Had they done that, I mean, SMW was on the hit list for the Taliban as well as their families. So that was pretty scary for those guys. But Congressman Gonzalez and I basically split ways at that point. So he focused on the diplomatic piece, and he was actually working to get them out of Uzbekistan. And he was working with different politicians and diplomats around the world looking for a place for them to go pending being allowed to come to the U.S. What I did was I got with the guys once they were allowed to use their phones, and it was on and off that they were using their phones, but I was able to communicate with them to get accountability of them. And the second piece was to start working on getting their families out. And once we did that, that's when, talk about relationships, I went to our friend Doug. And a quick background on him and I is that I served in a unit with a mutual close friend of ours. And I actually met Doug at this friend's retirement ceremony and party several years ago. We didn't really keep in contact, but when I got to Kabul, I ended up at a meeting with some interagency folks, and he was there. So we reconnected and kept in touch after I left. And then when those guys needed fuel at HKIA, he's the first guy that I reached out to, and he was actually working on getting them fuel when they got it themselves. But as far as getting the families in, so he was in and out of Afghanistan during the summer, but he was on the ground. And when I reached out to him, he said, let's get it done. And so Nick and I were able to connect, both of us, from Virginia and Qatar, were able to connect with him and also a couple other members of Nick's team in Qatar. We had a small message group that we called Whiskey and communicated through that to have some amount of OPSEC and just to keep the group small. And we used that method to communicate and to work with the families to get them out.
So can you tell us about the first family that you got? Because it has to be surreal when you make a leap from like, hey, this is a disconnected thing. Like, even Nick over in Qatar, he's connected. Like, he's on the networks and he's able to like look into there pretty quick. He's got the resources that you need. But you from Alexandria, Virginia, on a small text chain amongst some professionals, it had to be surreal the first time that you're like, wait a second, I can affect change. I can make this happen. Like, let's find, what was the very first go of this look like where you guys were successful and got one of the families out?
So for me, it was my friend and instructor pilot that I flew with. His name is Mo. We were able to get his family out, and that was worked through Doug and Nick and some of our other team members on whiskey. But as you can imagine, there was a lot of communication going back and forth on multiple text groups, emails. I mean, the amount of information coming in was not manageable. There was just too much, which is one of the reasons we cut down some of the groups that we had been involved with to whiskey. And there was also promises being made that weren't followed through with from certain groups and individuals and such. So with Doug, although the communication was not always consistent simply because of what he had going on the ground, which you can't even imagine, Sean could probably relate to that pretty well. But anything he said he was going to do, he did. He made it happen. And when we got the first family in, it was out of the blue. We had them pre-positioned. We had them set. Nick and I had been communicating with them. We had them give their location only once we were ready to move them through a gate, because we didn't want to put them at risk any more than they already were. But we got that first family in out of the blue. Doug texted and said, "Hey, they're in." And it was surreal. I mean, it was just certainly an emotional moment, not only for us, but, my wife, Lorraine, was with me the entire time this was going on. She was teleworking and she was involved and assisting, and, it was something.
That group chat had to be pretty rowdy after that, right? The whiskey group chat had to just erupt like, holy crap, we got it in. But you guys didn't stop there. So then you just started figuring out, I'm assuming through Doug, Nick, is on the ground from Qatar and the over the horizon capability that, a bunch of us have a little bit of experience with, and you on the ground in Alexandria and Doug on the ground, working through those gates. But the situation, just got worse. As we progress in timeline here from where you guys got your first family out, you started to get more, probably got better at it. It was probably, there's probably a day or two where you're like, hey, I got a couple wins in a day, and you're just like, okay, go on about business, because that's how this thing went. But, then Abbey Gate happens and we lose 13 service members and things become very, very real. What were you guys doing during, the mass casualty that was Abbey Gate?
Yeah, so I had the luxury, unlike Lee, who's kind of doing all of this, from his living room, just he and Lorraine. I had a whole staff with me down in Qatar, and it's U.S. Army aviators. I had U.S. Marine Corps aviators, U.S. Air Force special operations folks. I mean, even our we had a finance officer that was helping us out. And we also, because of just our location in the OTHCT headquarters, I've got, reach back not only to Tampa and to Fort Bragg, but also the folks that are still in Kabul. And we've got friends in the 82nd that are on the ground manning the gates. One of the gates is manned by the Marine Corps, and I've got 3 Marines on my staff sitting in my same room, and so they're on the phone with their friends that are running the Marine Corps gate. So we've got about 9 irons in the fire while all of this is happening, and doing it all simultaneously, which was cool to watch. And so our first success story, well, I guess I'll rewind a little bit. The night of all of the aircraft leaving HKIA and going up to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, we get everybody out, and we're all kind of celebrating, high-fiving, and everybody kind of leaves the office. And then I get a panic phone call from a friend back in the United States. Hey, he's got 2 buddies, both former JSOC operators, now U.S. contractors. They are stuck in their hotel in downtown Kabul, and they need help. And so I immediately go back to the office, and we've got, multinational task force with us there. So our British SAS counterparts, and they've still got teams on the ground trying to rescue British citizens and everything. So I asked them for help, show them the location, and ask if they've got a team in the area, and they absolutely did, and helped us rescue these 2 former JSOC soldiers and get them into HKIA. And that was, we didn't know it at the time, but that set the stage for what would be like our next 4 days of solid work. And luckily, we had two folks on my staff that had a whole bunch of personnel recovery experience. I was the commander of the U.S. Army SEER School for a couple of years, and then I was the 18th Airborne Corps PRCC director. And then one of my pilots that was working for me used to be a JSOC SEER and PR instructor. So we're well aware of, how to do personnel recovery operations. And as we see, like, this is what this is turning into. It was a good benefit to have that experience to draw from and have that expertise resident on the staff. And so while we're coordinating with all of the elements at HKIA, our first success story was a former SMW squadron commander who had just recently retired, Colonel Kohestani, and his family, that they were in line at the Marine Corps gate. And so we text message over Signal and WhatsApp. Of course, that's not at all secure, but this is how people are communicating in Afghanistan at the time.
It's in any port in the store, man. I always used to laugh when we would go to Africa and you'd be like, hey, here's the, everybody uses WhatsApp here, and everybody would freak out. They'd be like, listen, guys, China owns all the inner systems and you can't talk on WhatsApp. We're like, listen, man, we know, but if you want to talk to the partner force, it's the only thing they got. So you're either going to talk to them or you're not going to talk to them. So you figure out a way to be better about the security. Sorry to interrupt.
Right.
I hate WhatsApp.
It's only stupid if it doesn't work, right?
Exactly, 100%.
And so we get Colonel Kohestani up to the front of the line. He's, I'm sure he's roughing people up, trying to get he and his massive family up to the gate. And we're essentially in direct communication with the guard at that gate. And we're like, all right, he's raising his hand right now. He's like, okay, I see him. And then we get his whole family inside HKIA. And that was kind of our first big success story. And it just spiraled from there. But it was a lot of coordination. I won't point fingers at some of the organizations that were on the ground at HKIA that were not helpful, because there were definitely some that were not helpful. Some of our U.S. special operations entities that were still there, they were extremely helpful. And so, in combination with them and with Doug, getting folks in through the gate that, was highlighted in the CNN article and what Lee had talked about in our article from War on the Rocks, that ended up being the most fruitful way to get people in. And the Taliban, I think, figured out very rapidly that if they would call in a threat to any of the gates, the U.S. military would shut down the gates for a certain amount of time until the all clear was given, and then they would start letting people back in. And they used that quite frequently to kind of stem the flow of refugees into the airport trying to get out. So as the SMW commander at Kandahar, I also had the dual hat job. I was the senior airfield authority, or like the airfield commander at Kandahar, and I had an Afghan civilian counterpart through the ACA, which is like the Afghan version of the FAA. He was in line at the Abbey Gate, and so I'm also trying to help he and his family get out. Even though he wasn't in SMW, but he and I had established that relationship from down in Kandahar. And I'm telling him, looking at all of the feeds that we have access to in Qatar at OTHCT, and I'm telling him which gates have the best lines, and he's going to them, and he's waited in line like 3 days in a row just trying to get in. Then I finally tell him, Abbey Gate, that's the one for today. They're expecting you at the gate. Just get up to the front, yell your name, and they'll let you in. And he was in line just a little bit away when the suicide bomb went off and closed the gate. He was thrown, he was close enough to the explosion that he was thrown from the line into the ditch that was right next to the road that's all full of, dirty, awful Afghanistan muck water. And got separated from his family. He's there with his parents and his wife and their son and his mother-in-law. And they all get separated in the mass chaos. And we all know after that, the gates closed and they never opened back up.
Sure. And, as good as it felt, probably, your successes, I bet that, for all your hard work, that had to damage the morale of the team. How did you keep everybody focused after taking such a hard loss as being so close and then being turned away in such a violent fashion?
Yeah, so at that point, we had been in the office, the whole team awake for 52 straight hours, just, working with Doug, working with other U.S. SOF entities to get people into two various gates. Again, the one from the article was the most successful. And we would have people like stacked up in tranches. Like, all right, tranche one is at the meeting location. Doug would go out and meet them and escort them through the gate. And then we would just have the next tranche ready to go at the meeting location as soon as we would say, okay, move. And then they would have people lined up and ready to go. One of the other lieutenant colonels, Afghan lieutenant colonels in SMW, was kind of marshaling the whole piece. And this is Ibrahim Keel. He was a godsend. Like, without him, we wouldn't have got anybody inside that gate. And he refused to go in himself. He would only make sure the next group of people were all ready to go, and he would help do the link up with the Americans that were coming out to escort him in. And he would just have groups of people. If I tell him, all right, we're ready for the next 50, he'd have 50 people lined up and ready to go. And so we had already got in, I think, 159 SMW members and their families through the couple of various gates that we were using when the Abbey Gate explosion happened. And he had another 111 people in the link-up location ready to go, and Doug was ready to go out and get them. And that's when the 82nd just said, all right, we're sealing up all the gates, and no one else is coming in. And we were feeling very high because we were super successful up until then. And then when we finally, 52 hours into this piece, realized, like, that's it. And that was one of the most, one of the most defeating feelings I've ever had.
Yeah, Nick, it's really hard to get called off a mission, man. Like I could tell you from personal experience from being on that plane and getting told no. I could tell you how bad that sucks, man, because you know the good that you're doing behind the walls, and it's hard to communicate
we
that.
were rolling. I mean, we were being so successful. We had the system down to a T, and then it just gets shut off like a water faucet. And we had been awake for so long, like, it was hard to process.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you feel, even though you're awake for that long, 72 hours, 96 hours awake, any one of our guys will tell you, there's a sweet spot in there where you feel like you are just absolutely crushing life. It does not matter. You're doing good. Everything that you're doing is efficient and pointed towards mission accomplishment. That's it's a high and a feeling that no one can possibly replace when you save a life in that manner. Lee, when you got that news of this might be time to shut down, what was your process? How did you feel?
Well, as you can imagine, it was disheartening. My primary focus at that point was on our warriors that had been killed, right? And yet, the good news out of this story that Nick just shared is that we were able to get another family in after Abbey Gate. And it was an exception. But another friend, Irfan, his family was pre-positioned and ready to go with the group that Nick just talked about. And after the Abbey Gate explosion, we told people that there was no guarantee we were going to be able to get anyone else in. But it was up to them whether they stayed or went and how long they were going to stay for. This family decided to stay and wait it out. And the next day we were able to get that family with Doug through the gate. And that was an amazing feeling after all that had gone on, after the loss of the American lives and after the morale of our Afghan partners going down, so much, not thinking that anyone else would get through. When we got the Irfan family through, that wasn't just a small victory, that was a huge victory.
And ever since that day, you guys haven't stopped telling this story. You went out on War on the Rocks, that great article, and I'll make sure to link it and everything to do with this episode and get it out there. It was a fantastic and a fascinating read of how we used all these separate agencies together in a million different ways. And your operation was a small piece of a larger operation that was going off, literally worldwide during this thing. The impact that you had for this operation, for those families individually, and then as a whole, and to the morale of the brothers and sisters that you both worked with in the SMW, it's commendable. It should be emulated as something that we're supposed to do. But as this event was coming to an end, you were unable to get as many families through, and then it was obvious that we were going to have to leave HKIA, and the Americans themselves were going to have to go. As you both processed the imminent end to this thing, as we were buttoning it up and the security positions were closing down, and generally we were starting to get ready to get out of there, were you guys okay with the decision? I imagine, Nick, you wanted to stay and you wanted to keep working, or stay engaged in the event, not stay locally, but how did you feel in that moment, as you walked the team through, hey, this is how we're going to close up shop?
Yeah, so we had still, at that point, we were very optimistic that, us leaving HKIA was, just kind of one small speed bump in the continued rescue efforts for all of our brothers from SMW, just because we knew we'd seen the text messages from the Taliban on how there's, 3 organizations from ANISOC that the Taliban were going to still continue to target, and ours was one of those. And so we were sure that the government would still have a continued effort to help rescue those folks and get them out of harm's way and get them to someplace safe, whether that be a neighboring country or, ideally we'd like it, all the way back to the United States. And we were in pretty good contact with the State Department and processing the P1 and P2 and special immigrant visas up until that point. So we were still very optimistic and hopeful that this was going to be a continued effort. And then just it took a long time for us to all realize that, the Taliban were going to make that extremely difficult. They weren't going to let aircraft in. If they did let an aircraft land, they weren't letting anybody get on it. And so it was, a slow build for us to see that, oh man, this is going to be super tough, and this is not going to be a quick effort. This is going to be years or decades of still trying to work to get people out. And it didn't hit as hard as the initial end to the NEO had hit, just because that took months to kind of build all that situational awareness to see how difficult and long of a road this was going to be.
Sure. And you stay engaged, to this day. Lee, where can people go to find some sort of resource if they want to support? There's a million different organizations out there. You guys are trying to get this story out as much as you can. And like we talked about earlier, I think this is probably, especially for us, speaking for Trent and Peaches here, this is at the end of our 20-year GWOC career. We spent our entire lives going over and thinking about Afghanistan. Like, this was our entire life. And to have it end in the retrograde and the way that it did, everybody feels some type of way about it. Ask me any given day and I'll have 2 different opinions on how I feel about the whole thing. But you want to stay engaged and we want to continue to make good, positive efforts. How do we continue to do that today? Because there's still, Nick, as you alluded to, this is a years-long process of how we're going to get these folks out and get them some help. So Lee, is there anything that we can do? Is there anything that you work with or work on that would be helpful for folks out there to engage with?
Well, to back up just a little bit, Aaron.
Oh, sorry.
You talked about the end there, when we left HKIA. So for me and Nick as well, there was really a transition to getting our folks out of Uzbekistan and taking care of the families that came to the United States and didn't have their husbands with them or their fathers because they were still in Uzbekistan. So Congressman Gonzalez, as I mentioned, he was still engaged in that diplomatic/political effort. And I stayed in constant communication with him and with some of his staff on that. And then Lorraine and I actually welcomed the families at Fort Pickett when they came in. We were able to get access to them. We were able to provide them with blankets and extra food and just some company to make sure they felt as welcomed as possible. And moving forward, of course, we're still in touch with them. We still have a very good relationship with the four specifically that we were engaged with and their families. The biggest thing that would help these people would be for the State Department to get their visa situation fixed from parole visa to a legal permanent resident, and then gradually work towards citizenship. And the other thing that would really help them is for the FAA, for the Federal Aviation Administration, to recognize their flight training conducted by the U.S. Air Force and grant them licenses that are equivalent to what they had done in Afghanistan. Because all of these men want to get back into aviation. They want to fly professionally for a living. And so Congressman Gonzalez is also involved in that. Doug is involved in that. We're working toward that together. But if the State Department were to assist them with visas and the Federal Aviation Administration were to license them appropriately based on their experience and training, that would be a big enablement for them and their families.
Well, I hope it happens. The bureaucracy that is involved in the State Department and some of these, application processes is just immense. And I know that it has to be frustrating for those guys. But if there's anybody that deserves it, it's these guys that fought right alongside you guys in the SMW, in Afghanistan. I've been on an Mi-17 piloted by an SMW individual before. So, it's 1 degree of separation away. Nick, as we kind of like close this one up here, I kind of want to turn it over to you. I know that you're emotionally connected to this issue, and I know that you still work with it to this day, and you still try to get some help out there. But here's your shot, Nick. What do you want people to know about HKIA? Why is it so important for you to continue to talk about this years later?
I think what I would like to have people remember from this event is that it's not over. Like we still have hundreds, if not only SMW service members, but all kinds of ANISOC service members that fought right alongside Americans for the better part of 2 decades, and they are still trying to get out of Afghanistan. So one of the problems that we see with the P1, P2 visa or SIV application process is you have to be outside of Afghanistan to apply for it. And so a lot of the people that I still talk to are still inside Afghanistan trying to get out. They're actively being pursued by the Taliban still to this day. The Taliban have not forgotten what the SMW did, and they are hunted. And so for me to have to tell them like, hey man, I can't help you until you go to a different country is just a tough pill for us to swallow for those involved with Pineapple Express or Operation Sacred Promise or any of the organizations that are still dealing with our Afghan partners, trying to get them to safety. We have to tell them, I can't do anything until you get yourself and your family out of Afghanistan, which is still extremely challenging for these folks to do because they can't travel around freely. So I think what I would want people to know is just that it's not over, that people are still fighting for their lives every day. And they're people that we owe a lot to because they fought alongside of us because we promised that we would be there for them. And so far, I don't know that we've lived up to that promise.
Nick, that was as well said as I've probably ever heard it, sir. That was fantastic. I want to say thank you for sharing that, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I hope everybody hears that this is not over. This is a long, ongoing event. It requires constant attention, and as long as we have a platform to talk about it, we're going to keep doing so. Lee, Nick, I'd like to invite you guys on individually. I'd like to hear your story individually of what led you up to HKIA. Lee, prior PJ, now Army Aviation, and Nick, Army Aviation as well. Like, that's pretty cool. Like, we should probably talk about that. And we're working with the congressman to get Congressman Gonzalez on to tell from his optic as well. So that's coming as well. We are going to close it up for this one, but this is going to be just an intro to a part 2 and hopefully a part 3, because this story, as Nick was saying, it deserves to be told. And as long as we keep talking about these individuals, then they'll never go from this earth, right? So your name lives on. So Nick, Lee, thanks so much for coming. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe wherever we are. And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening to the One's Ready podcast. Train hard.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Don't hang up.